Doing your own automotive repairs doesn't have to be a mystery. That's what Car Care Seminar is all about, taking the mystery out of doing your own automotive repairs. Hi, I'm Scott Cusey, and I'll be your host as we take an inside look at repairing the suspension system on your vehicle. During each chapter, I'll cover troubleshooting and identifying failure symptoms, the tools needed to do the repair, including specialty tools when they're needed, along with some tips to help the job go smoothly. And also, I'll go through a close-up, step-by-step demonstration on how to perform the repair. I suggest reviewing the entire tape before beginning your repairs because that'll help you gain a good understanding of each complete procedure and how they relate to each other. Then, refer back to the specific chapter that you desire just prior to and during your repair to freshen your memory. Now, different vehicles are going to have slightly different procedures than what is shown on our tape. So for specifics on your vehicle, I suggest you consult an automotive service manual that details the steps for the year and make of vehicle that you own. Also, pay close attention to the safety tips mentioned throughout the tape, because the only good repair is a safe repair. The topics we'll cover in this tape include Chapter 1, checking the tire pressure. In Chapter 2, we'll talk about taking care of your tires and inspecting them. Chapter 3, we'll look at rotating and balancing your tires. Chapter 4, we'll replace the shock absorbers. In Chapter 5, we'll demonstrate clevis strut replacement. In Chapter 6, we'll look at ball joint strut replacement. In Chapter 7, we'll demonstrate clamp type strut replacement. In Chapter 8, we'll take a look at drive shaft type struts. In Chapter 9, we'll look at flange type struts. In Chapter 10, we'll replace a modified type strut. And Chapter 11, we'll look at replacing the struts on a GM W10 chassis. If you enjoy the self-satisfaction that goes along with doing your own repairs and you like to save money while doing them, make sure you check out our complete selection of Car Care Seminar tapes before you tackle your next repair. With our guidance and a little help from an automotive manual, you can be on the road to becoming a successful do-it-yourselfer. Okay, let's get started with our first repair.
In Chapter 1, we'll demonstrate the proper procedures for checking your tire pressure.
Your tires play an important role in getting you around daily. And it's a startling fact that flat tires cause over 30% of all highway breakdowns. And many of those flat tires could have been prevented with periodic care and inspection. And did you know that your tires are rated at a certain load capacity at a specified inflation? That's right. You want to make sure you don't overload that capacity. And that information can be found right on the side of the tire. Also, keeping your tires inflated properly is important because if they're low on air or if they're overloaded, they can overheat. And heat is one of your tire's worst enemies. And periodically inspecting your tires can also tell you the condition of a lot of suspension components, like steering linkages, ball joints, and your shocks or struts. Right now, let's go over and check the inflation on some tires. One of the easiest but yet most neglected acts of general vehicle maintenance is checking your tire pressure. A properly inflated tire will help provide maximum economy from your vehicle. It'll help ensure safe stopping, provide the best possible ride and handling around corners, and can help prevent premature tire wear or an unexpected roadside failure. Now, a lot of people think they can tell their tires are properly inflated just by looking at the sidewalls. Well, that's not actually true, because the radial tires that are used on today's vehicles have a characteristic bulge right down here at the bottom, and that actually makes them look like they're low on air when they're not. I suggest checking your tire pressure every couple of weeks, and when checking it, make sure you use a reliable tire pressure gauge. They only cost about $5 to $10, and you can easily save that much in tire life simply by keeping your tires properly inflated. I like to keep mine right in the glove box so it's readily available at all times. Now, when you check the pressure of your tires, they should be cool or driven 5 miles or less. So let's check this one. I'll just remove the valve stem cap and press the gauge onto the valve stem. Now, if your vehicle is equipped with tire valve extensions, you can check the tire pressure with the cap right in place. Now, generally, most tires call for about 32 to 35 pounds of air, and you can find the correct pressure in small print right on the sidewall of the tire. And ours calls for 35 pounds. Let's look at our gauge. Our gauge is only reading about 32 pounds. So we'll have to add some air to this one. Now if you don't have an air compressor at home, a good means for putting air in the tires is by having a portable air tank like the one I've got here. Just fill it up when you stop at the gas station, and then you'll have air when you need it at home. I'm going to add air to our tire right now. Okay, then I'll double check it with the gauge. We're at 33, so I'll add just a little bit more. Okay. Okay, looks like we're right at 35. You want to make sure that you add only a small amount of air each time and continually decide to recheck it. Now another way to have air on hand is to get a 12-volt mini air compressor like this. Just plug it into your cigarette lighter, and in a couple of minutes you can completely fill a flat tire. They're also handy to have around for airing up bicycle tires or for inflating anything else that you may have around the house. Now when you're done with each tire, make sure you put the valve cap back in place, because that'll keep road debris and dust and dirt out of the stem.
In Chapter 2, we'll take a look at inspecting your tires, identifying wear symptoms, and how to promote longer tire life.
Now whenever you're putting air in your tires, it's a good idea to take a little extra time to inspect the tread. I like to start with a visual inspection. You can look for cupping on the tread surfaces. If you see that, it means your shocks or struts are worn out and need replacing. If you see outside wear on the tire, that means you've either got an alignment problem or too much excessive high-speed cornering. Now if you see wear on both the outer edge and the inner edge, that's a sign that the tire's been run too low on air. Excessive wear in the middle of the tread is an indication that you've run the tire with too much air in it. Now the other item that you want to check is to check the tread depth. The most accurate means is to use a tread depth gauge. Here's how easy it is. Take the gauge, insert it in the tread, and then you can read the depth in 30/32 of an inch right on the side of the scale. And ours reads about 7/32 of an inch. If the gauge reads below 2/32 of an inch on your tires, it's definitely time for some new tires. Now another easy method is to use an ordinary penny. Just about everybody's got one of those at home. You just take the penny, turn it upside down, and insert it into the tread. You look across the tire, and if you can see the top side of Lincoln's head, your tires are worn out and aren't actually safe to drive on. The other thing you want to make sure you do is check the depth all the way across the face of the tire. Ours looks pretty good. Now the sidewalls of your tires also need a little attention from time to time. First off, try to avoid running your sidewalls up against curbs, because not only does it scuff the outside of your tires, it can damage the inner tire cords. Now when you're washing your car, don't forget to give the tires a little attention. I like to clean off the sidewalls with a spray-on tire cleaner. I'll just spray some on this one to demonstrate how well it actually works. I'll spray a little bit of cleaner onto the sidewall. Then I'll take a tire cleaning brush like this and scrub the whole sidewall of the tire. Now this tire cleaner will help whiten up the white sidewalls or white letters, and also it'll help remove any brown stains that might be left on the sidewall of the tire from putting on protectant. Okay? Now quite often what you'll just do now is hose it off and the tires will be clean, but for this demonstration I'll just wipe it off with a towel. If I wipe it off with a towel, you can see how nice and white the letters come out, and also the sidewall is left black and clean. Now once you've got them clean, you want to protect them also. I suggest using some spray protectant on them. We'll spray a little bit of that on. Now not only will spray protectant protect the outside of the tires, it'll also make them look a lot nicer. And the reason you want to do that is to protect it from the cracking, and the cracking is caused from the rays of the sun. But be careful not to get it on your wheels if they're chrome or aluminum, or you'll end up cleaning your wheels later too.
In Chapter 3, we'll address tire rotating and proper wheel balancing.
You know, many people don't realize that their driving habits actually affect the life of their tires. First off, avoid jackrabbit starts and stops. Secondly, avoid excessive high-speed cornering. I recommend not exceeding 20 to 25 miles per hour on entrance and exit ramps. And finally, avoid overloading your vehicle. Another area that's critical for maximum tire life is the correct balance. Make sure your tires are spin balanced when they're new or whenever they're remounted. If a vibration becomes apparent while driving on a smooth road, it may be caused by tires that are out of balance. Have them rebalanced and test drive your vehicle. If the vibration still exists, it may be caused by a drivetrain component or a misaligned front end. Now, another area that's often overlooked is tire rotation. Your front tires actually wear differently than the rear ones, especially on today's front-wheel drive vehicles, because the front tires not only carry the weight of the engine and steer the vehicle, they also have to transfer the power from the engine to the road. And therefore, the need for periodically rotating your tires is even more important today than ever before. I suggest rotating your tires about every 8 to 10,000 miles. An accepted rotation method is to move the front tires to the back and vice versa. Although if you have a full-size spare tire, you might want to include it during the rotation, in which case you would follow this pattern. If you have a space saver, or often called mini spare, you can't include that on your tire rotation, but it's a good idea to periodically take a look at that one too. I've got another car in the shop with a space saver spare. Let's go check it out. Now, the one item that you don't want to overlook when taking care of your tires is to check the spare. Ours is mounted right back here underneath this cover. Now, most of today's vehicles come with a space saver spare like this one. First off, check to see what the recommended inflation is. On ours, it happens to be 60 psi. With the same gauge I used earlier, I'm going to check the pressure of this one. Sure enough, it's low at about 24 pounds. So this spare probably wouldn't do you much good. So I'm going to add a little air in the air tank that we used. When adding air to a spare like this, check it frequently with the gauge. I'll add a little bit more here. A spare like this fills up pretty quick. Okay, that's right about 60. Now generally, if your spare is mounted in the trunk or a concealed area like this, it'll be in pretty good shape. But if it's mounted on the outside of your vehicle, make sure to check it for cracks and signs of aging, and then clean and protect it just like the other tires. While I'm back here, I'm going to pop this one out of here. So I like to take a look every once in a while and see if the jack and all the necessary pieces are in order. Okay, there's the jack and the feet and the tire lug wrench. Because a good spare won't do you any good if you can't put it on when you need it. Ever hear a squealing or scraping noise when you're approaching a stop sign? That means your brakes need repair. And the most inexpensive and easiest way to learn how to do it right is with our Car Care Seminar Brake System Repairs tape. From replacing your disc brake pads or brake shoes, to installing a new master cylinder or bleeding your brakes, the tools needed and the steps to do the job right are all demonstrated on this one tape. It's our Car Care Seminar Brake Systems Repair tape, available now at your local Champion Auto store.
In Chapter 4, we'll explain the benefits of gas shocks, how to identify worn shocks, and also demonstrate how easy they are to replace.
Today we've got an on-show suspension expert with us, Sam Strauss from the Merrimont Corporation, who's going to tell us a little bit about the suspension system on your vehicle and how shocks affect the overall ride. Sam, thanks for coming by.
It's a pleasure, Scott.
Now, shock absorbers. What is one and what does it do on my vehicle?
Okay, a shock absorber is a hydraulic device that controls the oscillation of the spring. And it does that by taking the up and down motion of the suspension and spring and converts it to heat and dissipates it.
Okay. Show us a little bit how that works.
Okay, what we have here is a hydraulic shock. And when you push it together, you have hydraulic fluid going through a valving circuitry. And you can see with the hydraulic shock that it requires the vehicle suspension and spring to pull it back up.
Okay. Now you've got another style of shock here.
The other style of shock is a gas charge shock. It also has hydraulic fluid in it, but it's pressurized with gas. And as you can see, with the hydraulic shock, when you push down on it, it comes up by itself. And this assures that the wheels stay in contact with the road all the time.
Okay. Now, you've got a Coke bottle over here that you're going to show us a little demonstration on to further explain the gas theory.
Okay. The theory behind gas is to keep the aeration of the fluid to an absolute minimum. Imagine that the pop in this bottle is the hydraulic fluid.
Okay.
And the carbonation from the pop is the gas. If you shake up the pop bottle, you get very little foaming until you introduce air into the system. Then you get a lot of foaming. Much the same thing happens inside the gas shock, in that the pressurization of the gas keeps the fluid from foaming and allows the fluid to go through the valving circuitry without the air, which gives you a more stable and constant ride.
Okay. Now, what are some of the indicators that I can look for to tell when my shocks need replacing?
There are physical indicators and there are performance indicators as far as shock failure. Some of your physical indicators will be worn out bushings at the mounting points, a badly dented shock which won't allow free motion of the shock, leaking from the shock, and cupped tires. If you get kind of a scallop effect around the edge of your tire, are all clear reasons to replace the shock.
Okay.
And some of the performance indicators are things like nosediving at stop signs, squealing of tires, or a lot of body lean when you go around an expressway ramp. Just generally not happy with the ride of the vehicle.
Okay, so those are things that I can figure out without even getting underneath the car. I can just tell by driving.
Exactly.
Now, what if my vehicle were sagging in the rear, Sam? Would that actually mean that my shocks are worn out and need replacement?
Yes, it is an indication that your shocks are worn out. It's also an indication that your springs have worn out. What has more than likely happened is because your shocks have worn out, it's allowed that spring to travel further with more oscillation, more cycles. Therefore, wearing out the spring. So if you keep new shocks on your vehicle, or good shocks on your vehicle, then you won't have to replace your springs.
Okay. That could be even important on front-wheel drive vehicles today.
That's right, Scott.
Now, you showed us a test called, I think you called it the bounce test, on how to check to see if our shocks are worn out.
Yes, let's go out to the car and I'll show you how that's done.
Okay. Hey, Sam, how about that bounce test now?
Well, what we're going to do here, Scott, is we're going to push down on the car a couple of times and we're going to be looking for a couple of things. First off, how's the dampening devices, whether their shocks or struts, feel when we push down on it? And secondly, when we let go of the car, how many cycles does it go afterwards? Typically about 2.5 cycles is borderline. Whether you have shocks or struts, if it goes more than 2.5 cycles, it's definitely shot and should be replaced.
Okay, well, why don't we check this one? Looked pretty mushy to me.
This is real mushy. This one went about 4.5, 5 cycles, and the struts on this particular car do need to be replaced.
Okay, now that's a very accurate test to determine if my shocks need replacing too, although, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, how difficult is it to replace my own shocks?
Why don't we take a look?
All right.
The first step is to park the vehicle on a level surface. Raise the end you'll be working on and support it with a set of jack stands. Make sure the jack stands are placed under the frame or a jack point and allow the weight of the vehicle to set down on the jack stands. Then block the tires on the opposite end of the vehicle from where you'll be working. If you're replacing the front shock absorbers, the top mounts will most likely be located under the hood of your vehicle and may be covered by a rubber or plastic protector. If you're replacing the rear shocks, the top mounts may be located under the car or may be located inside the trunk area. To help loosen rusty or stubborn bolts, spray all mounting hardware with a liberal amount of penetrating oil. For best results, do so a day before you are going to replace them to allow 24 hours for the penetrating oil to be effective. Although not necessary for most shock installations, we remove the front tire for ease of view. Next, remove the upper mounting bolt or bolts. In our example, the lower mount is also held in place with one bolt. Some vehicles have upper mounts that are held in place by two mounting bolts like this, while others have a single stud for an upper mount. When working on shocks with a single mounting stud, a shock installation tool as shown will help prevent the piston rod from turning when removing the nut. Here's how to use it. Place a hexagonal-shaped socket on the piston rod nut. Then use the special flange socket to hold the piston rod steady while removing the piston rod nut with an open-end wrench. Next, remove the lower mounting bolt or bolts and remove the old shock from the vehicle. On most front shock installations, the shock will have to be removed from the bottom side. If you're installing shocks with a single upper mount rod, install the cupped washer and rubber grommet before positioning the shock in the vehicle. Next, position the shock in place and install the lower mounting bolts. Install the upper mounting bolts and tighten them to the correct torque specification. On shocks with a single upper mounting rod, install the final rubber bushing, cupped washer, and rod nut. Tighten the piston rod nut until the rubber bushings expand to the same size as the outer diameter of the washer. Again, this is where the shock installation tool comes in handy. Lastly, take the car down off the jack stands and test drive the vehicle. Listen for any abnormal sounds such as loose mounts and note the handling characteristics of the vehicle.
Would you like to save some money each time you're at the gas pump and help our environment at the same time? Simple. Keep your engine in tune. An easy way to learn how to do it right is with our Car Care Seminar Engine Tune-Up Tape. From replacing your spark plugs, inspecting your distributor cap and rotor, or setting your ignition timing, this tape will take you step by step through each procedure and the tools needed to do the job the right way the first time. It's our Car Care Seminar Engine Tune-Up Tape, available now at your local Champion Auto store.
In this chapter, we'll explore McPherson-type strut suspensions and also how to replace a Clevis-type strut.
Today we're visiting with a suspension expert, Sam Strauss from the Merrimont Corporation. He's going to tell us about McPherson struts. Sam, glad you could be with us.
Pleasure, Scott.
What is a McPherson strut?
Well, Scott, a McPherson strut is everything the shock absorber is, but it's been designed to eliminate some suspension components that are normally found in your conventional suspensions. Namely, the rod is beefed up to take the same place as a control arm. You can see in a conventional shock, the rod is much smaller. In the McPherson, it's much larger to take those loads, whether they be acceleration, braking, or lateral loads and turning.
Okay, where did the design for a McPherson strut come from?
An engineer worked for Ford Motor Company by the name of Earl McPherson, designed it in the early 30s.
Why has it become so popular today on today's vehicles?
It's become so popular in today's vehicles to save weight. By eliminating the upper control arm, it saves quite a bit of weight and room and allows more room for front-wheel drive components.
Okay. Now, how do I tell if my McPherson strut needs replacement?
Well, there are two ways of telling, both physical indicators and performance indicators. Some of the physical indicators are leaking, rusted out spring seat, dented body, which will mean that chances are you can't get the correct alignment angles in it, are all clear reasons to replace the strut.
So that's something that I'd have to probably crawl underneath the vehicle a little bit and do a little inspection to find out.
That's correct. Your performance indicators are things like nose diving at a stop sign, a lot of body lean while going around a turn on an expressway, squealing of tires and so forth, are indicators that you need to replace the strut.
And that I can tell just by driving the vehicle down the road.
That's correct.
Okay, how difficult is it to replace my McPherson struts?
It's not really very difficult. It comes off much the same way as a regular shock absorber, in that you have an upper mount that has to be removed and a lower mount. After the strut's off the car, then you have to compress the spring and remove that. This is the way the strut looks without a spring on it.
So this is a new replacement unit here.
Right.
Do you have an example?
Yeah, let's take a look.
Okay.
The items you'll need to replace your McPherson struts include the correct size wrenches for the lower mounting bolts, a 1/2-inch drive socket set, a hammer and punch, a torque wrench, a jack and a set of jack stands, and some penetrating oil. The specialty tool needed is a strut spring compressor, which is usually available for rent or sale where you purchase your struts. The items you'll need are the replacement strut assemblies and a new strut cushion and boot. The first step is to familiarize yourself with the instructions prior to beginning your removal. Then park the vehicle on a level surface and raise the end you'll be working on. Set the parking brake and block the tires on the opposite end from where you'll be working. Place jack stands under the frame of the vehicle and allow the weight of the vehicle to rest on the stands. Spray any mounting hardware with penetrating oil to help loosen rusty or stubborn bolts. In our example, we first removed the brake line bracket attached to the strut and moved the brake line off to the side out of the way. With the correct size wrenches, loosen and remove the lower strut mounting bolts. With the nut near the end of the mounting bolts, give them a solid rap with a hammer to loosen the bolts in the mounting. Remove the nuts and drive the lower mounting bolts the rest of the way out with a hammer and punch. Now hold the strut in place and pull on the rotor and lower mount to separate the strut from the lower mount. Next, move up to the top side of the strut mount. There is a large nut in the center, which is the piston rod nut. Do not remove this nut at this time. Now remove the upper housing nuts with the ratchet and socket. Before removing the last upper housing nut, place a shop towel over the CV boot, which is located directly below the strut assembly. This will help protect the CV boot from damage during strut removal. While holding the strut assembly from the lower side, finish removing the last upper mounting nut and remove the entire strut assembly from the vehicle. Now move over to the workbench and mount the strut securely in a bench vise. Although not necessary, it will definitely make the disassembly procedures go easier. Then lubricate the threads of the spring compressor before installing it on the spring. Position the compressors on the strut spring so you'll be compressing as many spring coils as possible. Locate them 180 degrees apart from each other and begin tightening them with the ratchet wrench. Compression of the coil spring is necessary to remove the spring and upper mount from the old strut. The spring compressor is tight enough when you can freely move the spring on the spring mount. Now, loosen and remove the upper piston rod nut and remove the upper support housing from the strut. Lift the spring and upper spring seat, compressor attached, off from the strut and set it aside. Remove and discard the old strut and secure the new strut in the bench vise. Only secure the new strut on its mounting flange to prevent damaging the cylinder body. In our application, we had to install a spring guard on the spring seat as shown. Next, install the new striker plate over the piston rod. Slide the new strut compression bumper on the piston rod with the correct side up. And position the new strut boot in place. Work the boot down over the lower strut body and also up and over the strut compression bumper. Lastly, secure the new dust boot in place with the wire tie supplied. Now position the coil spring and spring compressor in place on the new strut body. Twist the spring until the lower coil is in place with the indent in the lower spring seat. Before reinstalling the upper spring seat, you must remove the old dust boot and strut bumper cushion as demonstrated. Install the upper spring seat and twist it into place until the stop is in alignment with the upper end of the coil spring. Now, reinstall the upper support housing. Install the new washer and begin threading the new piston rod nut on by hand, and then continue by snugging it in place with the ratchet and socket. Using a screwdriver to hold the upper support housing in place, we completed our final tightening of the piston rod nut with a torque wrench. Torque this nut to the factory recommended torque specification. Now carefully loosen the spring compressors with the ratchet by alternately loosening each side equally until you can remove the spring compressors from the spring. Lastly, before reinstalling the new strut assembly on the car, align the tongue in the upper housing with the lower mounting flange as shown. Position the new strut assembly on the vehicle and start the upper mounting nuts on by hand. With the upper mounting bolts all started by hand, begin by snugging them in place with the ratchet wrench. Complete final tightening of the upper mounting bolts by torquing them to factory specifications with a torque wrench. Hold the lower end of the strut in place and align the lower strut mount. You may need to wiggle the strut and mount around a little to ease alignment. Install the lower bolt, and then install the upper mounting bolt. Next, install the eccentric washer and nut on the lower mounting bolt. It is critical this bolt is in the same position as removed from for proper wheel alignment. Now reinstall the brake hose mounting bracket. Start the bolt in the threads by hand and tighten securely with a socket and ratchet. Snug up the lower mounting bolts and complete final tightening with a torque wrench to the correct factory specifications, and you're done. The last step is to have the front end of your vehicle aligned by a certified alignment specialist. Correct wheel alignment is critical for proper vehicle handling and tire life.
Ever notice blue smoke out of the tailpipe of your vehicle? That means your engine's worn out. But there's an easy way to revitalize your engine, and that's by following our Car Care Seminar Engine Rebuild Tape. It'll take you step by step through all the procedures needed, including the tools that you'll need to do the job right, as well as removing the engine, disassembling it, measuring the parts, reassembling, and the reinstallation of the engine. It's our Car Care Seminar Engine Rebuilding Tape, available now at your local Champion Auto store.
In Chapter 6, we'll demonstrate a typical ball joint strut removal.
In our last chapter, we covered how to replace a McPherson strut assembly with the clevis style of mounting. In this chapter, we're going to talk about a ball joint type strut. Now, the types of struts get their name from the lower mounting flange. Basically, 90% of all McPherson strut assemblies mount similar on the top, so we're not going to repeatedly cover the upper mounting section. What we'll do in the next 4 chapters is actually detail the lower mounting removal. And in this chapter, we're going to talk about ball joint type struts. This style of strut is commonly found on BMWs, Mercury Capris, and Volvos. With the vehicle supported with jack stands, use a brake line wrench to loosen the line nut on the rigid brake line and remove it from the flexible brake line. Remove the nut or clip holding the flexible brake line to the strut mounted bracket and withdraw the flexible brake line from the bracket. Remove the nut securing the tie rod end of the steering arm. On some vehicles, this nut may be locked in place with a cotter pin that must be first removed. Using the pickle fork and hammer, separate the tie rod end from the steering arm. With the tie rod end moved aside, locate the nut that secures the lower control arm ball joint to the lower end of the strut. This nut is also often locked in place with a cotter pin that must be removed. Remove the nut securing the ball joint stem to the lower end of the strut. Position a pry bar on the top of the control arm and exert downward pressure to separate the ball joint stem from the lower end of the strut. Remove the upper mounting and the strut can be removed from the vehicle.
In Chapter 7, we'll demonstrate how to remove a typical clamp-type strut.
Clamp-style struts are commonly found on Datsuns, several Honda models, Subarus, and Toyotas. To remove the strut from the vehicle, it's necessary to remove the brake line from the strut-mounted bracket. Generally, there are 2 types of brake line mounts used in this style of strut. For the first type, the brake line bracket is mounted to the strut with a bolt. Simply remove the bolt in the bracket to remove the brake line from the strut. For the second type, it is necessary to open the brake line. With a flare nut wrench, loosen the nut on the rigid line and separate the rigid line from the flexible line. Remove the spring clip that secures the flexible line to the strut-mounted bracket and separate the flexible line from the bracket. Locate and remove the bolt that pinches the strut assembly in the clamp mount. Place the chisel on the split of the clamp socket and tap the chisel a few times with the hammer. This will spread the socket slightly, enabling easier removal. Place the pry bar on the lower control arm and push down on the pry bar to separate the lower end of the strut from the clamp socket and move the clamp socket aside. Remove the upper mounting and the strut can be removed from the vehicle. Ever wonder how many fluid levels there are in your vehicle? Actually, you could have up to 8 of them, and they all need to be periodically checked. Want to learn how to do it the right way and the easy way? Get our Car Care Seminar General Vehicle Maintenance Tape. From checking fluid levels to replacing your wiper blades and even taking care of your tires, we'll share the tips with you to help the job go safely, as well as the tools needed to do the job right. It's our Car Care Seminar General Vehicle Maintenance Tape. It's available now at your local Champion Auto store.
In this chapter, we'll describe a typical drive shaft type strut removal.
Drive shaft type struts can be found on several Audi models and VW Dashers. First, locate the nut securing the tie rod end to the steering arm and remove the securing cotter pin. Loosen and remove the nut from the tie rod end. To remove the tie rod end from the steering arm, we suggest using a tie rod end puller. This will prevent any damage to the threads or boot of the tie rod end. Place the puller around the tie rod end and turn the load screw on the top of the puller with a wrench until the tie rod end separates from the steering arm. Locate and remove the bolts securing the brake caliper to the backing plate. Lift the caliper off from the rotor and wire it up underneath the inner fender. Do not allow the caliper to hang by the brake hose, as damage to the hose can result. Remove the hub attaching nut from the center of the rotor assembly. Locate and disconnect the bolt or bolts securing the ball joint to the lower end of the strut. Drive the bolt out using the punch and hammer. Do not turn the bolt out, as damage to the threads may result. With the bolt totally removed, place a pry bar in the lower control arm and push down on the pry bar to separate the ball joint stem from the lower end of the strut. Once the ball joint stem is clear of the strut assembly, pull the assembly off from the drive shaft. Remove the upper mounting, and the strut can be removed from the vehicle. Have you ever tried to start your car and you've got a dead battery? It could be several different problems. Want to learn how to troubleshoot and fix it the right way? Pick up our Car Care Seminar Starting and Charging Systems Repair Tape. From understanding and maintaining your battery to actually troubleshooting and replacing your alternator or starter, we cover it all on this tape. The tips to help the job go safely, as well as the tools needed to do the job right. It's our Starting and Charging Systems Repair Tape. It's available now at your local Champion Auto store.
In Chapter 9, we'll demonstrate a typical flange-type strut removal.
Flange-type struts can be found on BMWs, several Datsun models, Dodge Colt and Challengers, Mazdas, Plymouth Arrows and Sapporos, and several Toyota models. First, using a flare nut wrench, loosen the nut on the brake line. Pull the C-clip out of the frame bracket and disconnect the flexible line from the bracket. Locate and remove the bolts on the underside of the steering arm. In our case, there were 3 such bolts securing the lower end of the strut. Place the pry bar on top of the control arm and push down to separate the steering arm from the lower mounting flange. Then, place the strut on top of the steering arm for support while removing the upper mounting bolts. Remove the 3 nuts securing the upper support housing to the inner fender and carefully pull the strut out from under the fender.
In Chapter 10, we'll take a look at something a little different, and that is the removal of a modified type strut.
On vehicles equipped with modified struts, the removal procedure is quite a bit different from those shown in the previous chapters. So in this chapter, we'll show the complete removal of a modified strut. Modified strut suspension systems can be found on Ford, Fairmont, Granada, Mustangs, and Thunderbirds, GM F-body models, Chevrolet Camaros and Pontiac Firebirds, and Mercury models Capri, Cougar, XR7s, and Zephyrs. First, block the rear tires. Then place the jack under the lower control arm as close to the lower ball joint as possible, but be careful not to damage the grease fitting on the bottom of the ball joint. Raise the car until the tire is a few inches off the ground. Raising the car more than this will allow the weight to transfer to the rear wheels, causing the front spring to extend, and you won't be able to remove the strut. Once the vehicle is raised to the desired height, place a jack stand under the front bumper for safety. Never work underneath the vehicle without the use of jack stands. Open the hood and loosen the piston rod nut a few turns. Use a screwdriver or vice grip pliers to prevent the piston rod from turning while loosening the nut. After loosening the nut a few turns, make sure there is a gap between the bottom of the piston rod nut and the top of the support housing. If the rod of the strut goes down inside the upper support housing as you are loosening the nut, the jack is not positioned properly and must be repositioned closer to the tire or ball joint. Finish removing the nut, the retainer, and the bushing. This is only a typical type of upper mounting, as there are many different variations of this upper mount. Consult the instruction sheet included with your new struts for the specific directions on your vehicle. Mark the wheel to stud location to assure proper wheel balance is maintained upon reassembly. Remove the lug nuts and remove the front wheel to gain access to the strut. Remove the bolts or mounting hardware securing the disc brake caliper to the backing plate. Lift the caliper off the rotor and support it with wire underneath the fender. Do not allow the caliper to hang from the brake hose, as damage to the hose may result. Remove the lower mounting nuts and bolts securing the strut to the steering knuckle, and the strut can be removed.
In our final chapter, we'll demonstrate how easy it is to replace the struts on the newer GM W10 chassis.
Sam, what have you got to show us here today?
Well, Scott, GM has come out with a new suspension system that allows us to change the strut without taking the strut out of the car or compressing the spring. We can service the car just as you see it now without jacking it up while it sits on the floor.
Okay, that sounds great. Now, this vehicle's pretty new. It looks like about an 88. How did you know that it needed struts to replaced in the front end already?
Well, the other day we were driving around and we noticed that there was a lot of body lean and a lot of nose diving at stop signs. So we decided that we were going to upgrade the suspension system.
Okay, more or less an overall mushy ride kind of in the front end. Okay, now what do you mean by upgrading the system then?
Well, as original equipment, this particular car came with hydraulic struts. We're going to upgrade that to premium performance gas struts.
Okay, similar to when we talked about earlier, the hydraulic system where you'd push the shock down, it'd stay down, whereas the gas unit, you would push it down and the rod would come back up. Now, what advantages does that provide for me, the driver of this vehicle?
Well, what that allows is less body lean going around curves, less nosedive during stopping, and overall gives us a little firmer ride and gives us a lot more reserve handability.
Okay, well, probably the suspension components would last a lot longer too.
Absolutely.
How tough is it to install on this type of vehicle?
It's really very easy. The average do-it-yourselfer should be able to do it in a couple hours. Let's take a look.
Okay.
The tools you will need to replace the front struts on the 87 and newer GM W10 chassis include a socket set and sockets, most likely metric, a torque wrench, and the correct spanner wrench for the installation. Spanner wrenches are usually available where you purchase your new struts. First, read and familiarize yourself with the installation instructions before starting the repair. Then park the vehicle on a level surface and open the hood. This is where the upper mount of the strut is located. Remove the retaining nuts that hold the strut mounting cover in place. Next, remove the piston rod nut. Then remove the strut mount bushing as shown. With the piston rod nut and strut mount bushing removed, position the special spanner nut tool to loosen and remove the compression bumper retainer. Give the retainer a quarter turn counterclockwise to release it, then remove it by hand. Now remove the compression bumper. This will provide access to the body nut. Again, using a special spanner wrench, loosen and remove the body nut. If yours is equipped with a fluid type of strut originally, compress the strut cartridge by pushing down on the piston rod, and then pull the piston rod upwards while holding the bottom of the cartridge down in the strut housing with a screwdriver. This will remove the excess fluid in the bottom of the strut housing, which is not necessary for the installation of the new gas cartridge. And lastly, remove the original strut cartridge from the housing. Another method for removing the excess fluid on the strut body is to use an oil suction gun as shown once the old cartridge has been removed. Place the new body nut on the new strut. The pins of the spanner wrench fit the holes in the body nut as shown. Insert the new strut cartridge in the housing and tighten the body nut securely. be sure you final tighten the body nut to the correct recommended torque specification. Now, reassemble the compression bumper to the compression bumper retainer. Again, notice how the spanner wrench fits the retainer. With the bumper in place, install the compression bumper retainer and tighten it securely. This nut simply locks in place, so torquing it is not necessary. Next, reinstall the strut mount bushing. Install the new piston rod nut, starting it on the threads by hand. And finish by torquing it to the correct torque specification. Lastly, reinstall the strut mount cover and retaining nuts. Just like on any suspension bolt, make sure to complete final tightening by torquing the nuts with a torque wrench. Test drive the vehicle and listen for any clunks or noises, and you're done. You've restored the comfort and ride stability to your vehicle and saved yourself money at the same time.
It really did look pretty easy, Sam. Are there any additional tips that you want to point out to us right now?
Well, when you're doing one of these, as GM calls them, W10 chassis, when you're servicing the strut, it's very important that you do not raise the vehicle after you start the servicing of the strut, because it may allow the spring to get out from under the fender. Could cause some personal injuries.
Sounds like a good tip. How about these specialty tools?
There's two specialty tools for doing this type of vehicle, and they should be available where you get your struts.
Okay. What
And
else?
Also, the instruction sheets. It's very important that you read them and thoroughly understand them before you start your strut job.
All right. That sounds good too. Thanks for coming by, Sam.
It's my pleasure.
Why don't we wrap this one up? Well, I hope our tape has helped clear up many of the questions that you might have had about doing your own suspension repairs. Now, the procedures we demonstrated are general in nature, so for specific details on your vehicle, please refer to the appropriate service manual. And before you attempt your next repair on your vehicle, make sure you check to see if there's a car care seminar tape available to help you along. Both the manuals and our series of car care seminar tapes are available at your nearby Champion Auto store. For Car Care Seminar, I'm Scott Cusey, and right now I'd like to thank our sponsors, our suspension expert Sam Strauss, and also thank you for choosing our tape. See you next time. One of the leading causes of roadside breakdowns are cooling system failures, and 90% of those failures could have been avoided. Want to prevent it from happening to you? Pick up our Car Care Seminar Cooling System Repairs tape. From testing your antifreeze to replacing a thermostat or even installing a new heater core, we cover it all. The tips needed to do the job safely as well as the tools needed to do the job right. It's our Cooling System Repairs tape. It's available now at your local Champion Auto store.